It's a very improbable journey. You know, the only person who believed in it was Jimmy Carter himself.
I regard it as the greatest leap from political obscurity in American history. The only one that seemed comparable to me was Lincoln's rise in the new Republican Party in the 19th century. But there's been no leap from obscurity to compare with what Jimmy Carter did.
James Earl Carter Jr. was born in 1924 to peanut farmers in Plains, Georgia. He served in the Navy, married his wife Rosa Lynn at 21, and they took over his parents' business.
I kept our books, and so it was not very long before I knew on paper more about the work than he did.
Jimmy Carter entered politics as a state senator. Then in 1971, he became Georgia's governor.
He was a tough, pragmatic politician, perhaps somewhat in the John F. Kennedy mode. And do what it takes to get there. You have to get elected in order to do good.
5 years later, Carter decided to run for the White House.
18 months ago, when former Governor Jimmy Carter announced he'd run for the presidency, people laughed. Jimmy who, they said. But now he's a most serious contender.
He won the Democratic Party's nomination.
An understanding man who can make ours a government of the people once again. Jimmy Carter, a leader for a change.
Jimmy Carter promised to be a different sort of politician.
He chose the right moment. This was in 1976. America was coming off of the Vietnam War and the Watergate scandal. And it was an era of disillusionment with sort of the notion of American exceptionalism.
I'll never betray the confidence that any of you has in me, and I will never avoid a controversial issue.
Would you place your left hand on the Bible?
The softly spoken Jimmy Carter promised a change, and Americans elected him president.
I, Jimmy Carter, do solemnly swear
That I will faithfully execute
that I will faithfully execute
the office of President of the United States.
There can be no nobler nor more ambitious task for America to undertake on this day of a new beginning than to help shape a just and peaceful world that is truly humane. And we will fight our wars against poverty, ignorance, and injustice.
As president, he appointed women and minorities into the public service and judiciary in record numbers.
I regarded his sensitivity on social policy as his strongest quality. I think his instincts to bring a moral component into American foreign policy were positive, but the results were uneven, I think.
His time in office was also marked by major foreign affairs successes, signing the Panama Canal Treaty, normalising relations with China, a nuclear arms treaty with the Soviet Union, and arguably the most historic, a Middle East peace deal ending the conflict between Egypt and Israel.
He managed to bring together Anwar Sadat of Egypt and Menachem Begin of Israel to Camp David for 13 eventful days in September 1978, and hammered out an agreement forcing them to agree to a very specific peace deal. It's a major achievement. It's something that never would have happened without Jimmy Carter's personal diplomacy.
On the domestic front, Carter deregulated the trucking, alcohol, natural gas and airlines industries, brought in mandatory seatbelts and airbags, and he installed solar panels at the White House.
He was a president who was way ahead of his time on many issues. And climate change is something that he's the first president in office to begin to talk about late in his presidency.
But the US economy faltered amid high inflation.
Americans still live well, but for many, the dream is fading.
We feel we're stepping backward instead of going forward.
Then the blow from which his presidency would never recover. The taking of Americans hostage in Iran in November 1979.
You should realize what we are going through and put in your mind, if you were in our place, what you would want the government of the United States to do.
A group of 52 were held captive for 444 days.
I continue to share with all of you the sense of outrage and impatience because of the kidnapping of innocent American hostages and the holding of them by militant terrorists with the support and the approval of Iranian officials.
The crisis worsened when a rescue mission ended in disaster, a US military helicopter colliding with a plane.
It was my responsibility as president to launch this mission. It was my responsibility to terminate the mission when it ended.
He was determined not to reply to the hostage taking with military retaliation because he feared, quite rightly, that this would endanger the lives of the hostages. And he trusted that diplomacy would eventually solve the problem, as it did. But this was very politically costly. He was seen eventually and portrayed by his Republican opponents as politically weak, and it wounded his presidency severely.
We can get into a war by letting events get out of hand as they have in the last 3.5 years under the foreign policies of this administration of Mr. Carter's until we're faced each time with a crisis.
The Iran crisis was like stepping on a landmine. All of these other factors might have been survivable, but that was, I think, ultimately the thing that destroyed his presidency.
In 1980, Jimmy Carter lost in a landslide to California Governor Ronald Reagan. He went back to his home in Georgia and a decade later built a centre dedicated, in his words, to alleviating suffering in the world. A regular election observer, he promoted democracy, peace and public health initiatives like ending guinea worm disease in Africa. It was for this work he was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 2002.
Well, I see his excellent post-presidency merely as an extension of his unfinished presidency, devoted to doing good works, to having public health initiatives around the world like eliminating guinea worm disease and vaccination programs, but also engaging in conflict resolution.
I think Jonathan Alter said he had the most successful post-presidency in American history. And I think that's the reason. He found it, he turned it into an arena for principle. I think it's historic, and I hope it's trend-setting.
Jimmy Carter recently celebrated his 100th birthday. His wife of 77 years, Rosalind Carter, died last year. He is survived by his 4 children.